Hey Zaka family! Zaka is launching an exclusive membership platform to provide you with career development workshops, coaching, community, and so much more. Go to ZakaConnect.com and sign up to receive information on how to access early registration and perks.
Hello, everybody. This is Paul Herman, the Prince of Motivation and host of Zaka Presents My Journey. We're creating this vulnerable and positive platform where you can get inspired and motivated from different leaders from our community. Today, our guest is Iman Solomonpoor, who is the Global Manager, Marketing Science at OMD USA. Iman, welcome to the show.
What's going on, Paul? Thank you for having me on.
Pleasure's all ours, young man. Pleasure's all ours. Welcome to the show. I'm definitely super excited to speak on your career, your journey, and all the things that you're doing currently right now. But before we do that, could you just tell our listeners a little bit more about where you started, like a little bit more of your culture background and where you grew up?
Sure. Yeah. So I grew up in Los Angeles, born and raised. I still live in Los Angeles. I'm actually living in Venice Beach at the moment.
Nice spot.
Yeah, it's an interesting place to live in. It's bustling, that's for sure. But I come from a Persian American background. So both of my parents are Iranian. They immigrated here after the revolution that happened in my home country. And when we came to LA, or when we actually moved to the area that I lived in Los Angeles, which is Santa Clarita, and it's a little suburb of LA. There weren't many Persian Americans living there. And so I was sort of one in a handful of people in my hometown that identified as Persian American, Iranian American. So that was a little bit of an interesting upbringing for sure. But yeah, speak fluent Farsi. That was actually my first language, and I used to be a little bit insecure about actually being who I was, having speaking a different language, eating different food in my home than the rest of my friends did. And it was a predominantly white area that I grew up in, at least for a majority of my life. And we moved to Santa Clarita when I was really young, about 5 years old. And that actually prior to that, we lived in the Valley, like the Van Nuys area. So a little bit more of a diverse mix there. But yeah, when we came to that area, I was a little bit embarrassed, I have to admit. And I think like ultimately that ended up becoming one of my biggest strong suits in my life, was actually growing up and feeling and being able to speak a different language and resonate with other cultures. Because I like to think that the Persian culture, like many other cultures, is an extremely rich one. So yeah, it's an absolute privilege to have grown up with the background that I grew up with. But that took a little bit of overcoming before I had to get to that point.
And what does the Persian culture mean to you?
Oh, I mean, it's everything. Persian culture is home. And also, I have to apologize if there is a background sound of like notifications coming in. I'm on my laptop and I may be getting some of those right now from a work chat. So I do apologize for that.
No worries.
But yeah, so the Persian culture for me, it's home. It's a big part of my identity. I think naturally you grow up in an atmosphere where there is in your home, whether that be good or bad, then that's filled with a culture of sorts. And that could be many things. And the culture that I grew up in specifically was the Iranian one. And so that represented everything from the art that I consume, and that includes music and visual art, to the food that I eat, like the culinary experience. And I think those are big parts of who we are as well. So the Persian culture to me just ended up representing my core, a big part of my moral system, a big part of my compass. A lot of who I am today has a lot to do with that culture that I was raised in.
Mm-hmm. And did you have any siblings, or was it just you?
I have a little brother.
Okay.
His name is Benson.
Okay, look at that. Shout out to little bro right there.
Yeah.
Could you tell us a little bit more about your childhood and like what were you passionate about when you were growing up, in that area?
Oh man, that's an interesting question. So I didn't play any sports growing up, actually. Mostly what I did was, to be completely honest, I actually didn't really care about. I was a terrible student in elementary school, the second half of elementary school, and then high school, or junior high and then high school. But so mostly what I did was a lot of skateboarding, a lot of messing around, just sort of not necessarily thinking, that my academic success would translate to success in the future, just sort of short-sighted. But I kind of just was focusing heavily in my upbringing of just a lot of skateboarding, and then sort of at home was just a lot of spending time with family, a lot of spending time with friends. That was sort of a big thing that I focused on, for better or for worse. And I think that's part of the cultural upbringing as well. The Persian culture is an extremely like hospitable one, where there's a lot of food and partying and all of those things, and your family comes over, and everybody spends the night, and it's like this wonderful experience. And so I think naturally I gravitated towards being a little bit of someone that just wanted to have a lot of fun.
Mm-hmm. Now, how did you get past? You said you weren't really a good student, but how did you get past that?
So I actually never went to college, so I don't think I necessarily ever got past that, to be honest. I think that was also another insecurity of mine for a little while, where I was like, I felt like I missed out on a big opportunity, and frankly, it is an opportunity to meet people at the very least. And I think people are ultimately a big factor in one person's success. It's ultimately reliant on multiple people seeing your value and giving you that opportunity. You can create your opportunity, but I think it has a lot to do with people's acceptance in the beginning stages, so that you can sort of get to a platform where you can start to really create those opportunities. And that is a big part of why I am where I'm at today. But I don't think I ever necessarily found school as something that I generally gravitated towards. And I think that's actually, and I've thought about this as well, and like recently, and I feel, perhaps it has a lot to do with where my interests lied at the time, or sort of how school is presented to me. And so, yeah, I think ultimately it's not something that I ended up solving perfectly. I had to just recognize that it wasn't for me in order for myself to be able to move forward.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Good. No, good. Good. School is, you got to know what you're doing, and obviously, there's a lot more in the world of today. You could podcast. There's, ebooks. There's a whole bunch of other ways. Just YouTube. Those things didn't exist at one point, but you could get a lot of your information from so many different places. Now, during your childhood, what were like some of the lessons that you learned that you still apply today to like your personal life?
Hmm. I think a big lesson that I learned as a child was kindness, and that had a lot to do with my mom. My mother is an extremely kind woman, and sometimes it's to her own detriment. And I think that I've come to find that despite a lot of these negative forces that that we may encounter on a daily basis, um, for a lot of us, I think that they ultimately can be met with kindness, and that really has a lot to do with like an example would be like, you have I live in Los Angeles. We are on the road a lot, and there's a lot of traffic and a lot of cars, and sometimes you may get heated behind the wheel. And sort of just recognizing to yourself, this person in front of you, and for whatever the circumstance may be, like recognizing that they're a human being, recognizing that they are also going through something, if you happen to be going through something as well, and just really having that empathy, and and through empathy you find kindness. And I think that like that was something that was just sort of given to me and taught to me at a very early age through my mom. So I do have to give her credit for that. And I think that like ultimately just leads to a little bit more of a sweeter existence, to be honest. You end up
Mm-hmm.
not having, you find yourself not falling into into bitterness as easily. So no, and I think that's a big lesson that I learned early on.
Mm-hmm. And how did those lessons apply to like your professional life?
So I work in advertising, and advertising in the avenue that I work in specifically has a lot of presentation involved, and there's sort of an aspect of public speaking. And I think within public speaking, empathy and kindness when there are ideas being tossed around is extremely important, because at the end of the day, everybody wants to be treated equally.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's where that premise of kindness comes in. It's recognizing within those calls, within my job specifically, um, it's okay if there's something that's being said that the room doesn't resonate with. It's just ultimately, and if I do disagree with that personally, I think it's important that we sort of still work through that and still recognize what that person is saying. And I think that ultimately is just where that kindness comes into play. It's making it a comfortable place to have conversation.
Mm-hmm. Now, you did take a moment to kind of highlight mom and talk about what she's kind of instilled in you. But what about dad? Did dad drop any of those gems in you at an early age?
Ooh, that's an interesting one too. Yeah, so my father is a man that I think taught me something a little bit, I think he sort of taught me a little bit something different, not necessarily deeply. I think it has a lot to do with sort of the trauma that comes with growing up in a foreign country that went through a revolution. And then essentially my father's background, just to give you a little bit of the background of who my father is before I get into what he taught me. He wasn't necessarily the most talkative man. He was a quiet man, or he is a quiet man rather. I just don't speak to my father that much anymore. So I think that like speaking about him in a little bit of like a past tense is why I'm saying was. But my father was someone that came from a country that had a lot of political issues, and I think those issues deeply impact one. And that's something that we don't necessarily experience as deeply here in the United States from at a firsthand level. And by that I mean like he went to war, he fought in a war, and so those things like really deeply impact a human being. Um, and so when he came to the United States and my mother and he met my mother in the United States and they got married, he sort of played the role of like a traditional like breadwinner. So like he would go to work, he would come home, and he would make money. And my mom also actually ended up also actually becoming the breadwinner later on in life. But at the time, sort of for a majority of my upbringing, my dad was the breadwinner, and with that, just required a lot of countless hours of his commitment to the job. And so because of that, he was a little bit distant. And so I'm sort of comfortable speaking about it now, but like through and that's through just thinking about it and through understanding it. But ultimately his contribution to me was not necessarily taught to me in the house. What he taught me was something a little bit more deeply rooted, which he's a passionate fisherman, my father, and he really a big part of my identity as well is being in the outdoors and being in the wilderness, and I spend a lot of my time out in the outdoors as well. With my dog, I have a dog named Bear, and we spend a lot of our time camping.
That's a
Uh,
bear.
yeah, and that's really what my father taught me was just an appreciation for the outdoors, an appreciation for something that went a little bit beyond sort of those traditional things that someone's father would teach them.
Well, shout out to mom and dad. They definitely dropped some gems on you to help you out in your
Absolutely.
journey. What is like one event that you could remember that like kind of shaped your life forever?
So I think a big moment that changed my life was actually when I was laid off from my first true corporate position. I think that at the time, obviously, it sucked. An experience that I don't necessarily think you need to go through this at all. But in my position, it was something that ended up becoming a big proponent to my success. So I worked at a company and I ended up getting laid off. I'm not going to say the company or name any names, but I ended up getting laid off for a reason that had to do with an acquisition. So my team was dissolved, and it was my first real corporate job within the field that I wanted to work in. And so I was like devastated at the time, and I actually went through like 3 months of unemployment following that happening. And then through that, I interviewed, and then I ultimately landed a job that ended up really propelling me into the professional that I wanted to be. And so that I think was a life-changing thing for me. And that's sort of, I would say, a more professional life-changing experience.
Okay. Okay. Now, those experiences, when those things happen, do you have anyone in mind that was like a mentor or someone that was coaching you through these life experiences?
Absolutely. I think a lot of the people that that were, or there are a lot of every single person in my life, I consider a mentor of sorts, from my friends to coworkers. which ultimately do, in some cases, do become my friends. I think, and my parents as well, and my siblings. So family as most importantly. So I think those people do end up coming out to support you, and I think that's a really important aspect of going through those times, is having that support system there. Um, and again, that's also in and of itself, it's a privilege. Some people don't have those support systems, and so it's I think about what that would look like if I did not have that support system and how I would have overcome that. But at the time, I found mentorship through everybody that was around me, through people that were also on my team that also happened to lose their jobs, and then also people that I knew that were working in the corporate environment, sort of guiding me through where I needed to go, who I needed to submit my applications to, and how I needed to interview. And I think that was a big factor into me being able to overcome that.
Mm-hmm. It's essential. A lot of the guests on the show have always expressed about having, especially during times where they're in need or they're at a low, having someone in their life as a mentor and a coach to kind of like guide them in a direction that could possibly help get them back on track. Now, when you talked a little bit earlier about your journey in education, you mentioned that school wasn't for you, right? So my question now is, how did you get into this whole, data science analytical stuff? I'm just wondering, like, you weren't in an establishment. Like, how did you fall in love with it? How did you even gravitate to that field?
Yeah, that's a great question. Yeah, so I used to work as a valet driver on Third Street, or actually, I'm sorry, Second Street in Santa Monica. I actually don't remember if it's second or fourth. It's one of them. And in this valet stand, there would be a lot of really nice cars that would come and park and give us their keys, and we would take their car and we would take it to the parking lot, and then we'd bring it back around when they leave. Just your standard valet driving experience.
Mm-hmm.
So it's sort of like, there's like, I've seen this on like Instagram recently, where there's people that they go and they like ask people with nice cars like what they do for a living, and they give them the answer, and it's an interesting trend. And so, but like this was I don't know, this was probably like 5 or 6 years ago now. Yeah, I think it was just about 6 years ago. And I would always ask the people that drove really nice cars, like, what do you do for work? Because I was also looking for sort of inspiration in what I wanted to do, because I didn't necessarily. So to give you a little bit more, I was working as an intern at the time at a law firm, and like that position came to me also through a network of friends, and just being able to, and resonating with friends, having this. It was actually my neighbor, is the person that lived above me, was like, hey, my law firm is hiring an intern, like, would you like to interview for it? And this is another like piece of context. Like, my plan was to go to community college and then become an attorney, like go to law school and then become an attorney. That was actually my original plan in my career, and that's something that I sort of was saying because I felt like that was just what my family wanted of me. And so I took some time, and I was like, okay, because my family wants this is what I'm going to do. And I think a lot of us make decisions that way. And I don't necessarily think that's the best thing for us. It's like, it's a great thing to want to please your family, but, ultimately you have to really think about what makes yourself happy so that you can impact the lives of other people in the best way possible.
I agree. 100% agree on that.
Yeah, man. I think that's a really big part of how we impact the world and who we are in this world. It has a lot to do with that love that you have within yourself and following your own path. So yeah, so that was my path. I wanted to become an attorney, and then but I was also working at this valet stand. Then my friend was like, hey, do you want to become an intern here? So I ended up interviewing, and I ended up getting the job. But this happened right before I started that.
And that was your first like actual job in corporate America?
That was my first actual job in corporate America. Before that, I was working a bunch of part-time jobs. I worked at a GNC. I worked at a frozen yogurt place. I worked at a Hollister.
All the traditional spots right there.
Oh yeah, man. And I think,
man,
it's an experience. I think I really do think a lot of people should go through that as well, because it really brings you to a humble place.
And also you had a little bit of that marketing in there. You were seeing a lot of things. Hollister, you said?
Yeah.
GNC, like the sales, marketing. There's a lot of things that happen in one day. depending on if you're on the floor. And so I remember working at a Disney store in Midtown Manhattan. I used to be like, oh my gosh, it's just so much is being processed in one time. But if you don't know it's coming at you, then you don't even know how to receive it, and you don't know how to apply it for the near future. So like, talk to us a little bit more about like that first job, and like what were like some of the lessons you learned in there, like from those experiences.
Yeah. Real quick on that one last question before I move over to that one, is just that one line that literally determined my entire like job path moving forward. Before I stopped working at that valet stand to become an intern at this law firm. I asked this one guy, like, he had a really nice car. I think it was like a Maserati. It was just some random nice car. And I said, "What do you do?" And he said to me, "Data is the new gold." That is what he said to me. And he got in his car. I'll never forget that moment. And he shut the door and he drove off. And I was just like, I Googled it. I was like, what does that even mean? Like, what is data?
That's deep. That was deep. Listeners, I hope you heard that. Data is the new gold.
It's an interesting sentence. It has so like, it's ominous. Like, I'm like, what is he talking about?
Yes. It would make you think. Like, what the? That's like if someone's like going to a guru and asking them for like, yo, what is the key to success? And someone says, data is the new gold. You're like, what?
All right.
I came all the way for this, but there's a lot of substance in there. A lot of that one line is strong. And if you're aware and you're knowledgeable and you're at a place to receive that, it would resonate with you, and you'd be like, okay, I got you. Say no more. I'm moving forward.
Exactly. And it took some time. It took some time for me to really like put into fruition sort of what that meant, and like and just hearing him say that for some reason resonated with me. And that's what sort of put me on that track. But I'm so sorry. What was the next question, Paul?
The next question was along the lines of like, in that corporate job, when you're working there for your first corporate job, like what was some of the lessons you learned in your first corporate job?
I don't consider. So I guess we would consider it an internship. I was wearing like a suit. I had to go to work in an office building, but like it wasn't
You remember
necessarily.
the suit? Hopefully you had a 3-piece suit.
Oh man, I had a 3-piece suit.
Let's get it. Come on. Let's go. 3-piece suit.
I didn't even, and I loved it too. I actually loved getting my dry cleaning done. I was like, oh yeah, like I'm a professional. Like I'm moving, like I'm an intern now. I work in an office building.
You made it when you have a 3-piece suit. Yeah, that's it.
Yeah, that's what I'm saying right there. It doesn't even matter if you're an intern or CEO.
That's right. Come on. It makes you feel a certain type of way, look in the role, right? It's important, especially when you're in an environment where everyone is someone at that level where they're executives. These are, CEOs. They're making hundreds and thousands of dollars. And you're like, I'm an intern. But like, what are some of those lessons now?
Huge. I used to say that my suit was my suit of armor. Like I would really say that to people. I would walk around because it made you feel a certain way, like you said, and you would, it would approach the world a certain way. You look good and you feel good and you can perform well, and that works in every setting. So yeah, I think some of those lessons that I learned at that first job, it just really had to do with how I presented myself, and how I presented myself in every room, right? And it was also just how I approached working for somebody above me. And I think you meet a lot of interesting people, especially in a corporate work environment where there's such a status quo of how things need to be conducted and how one needs to present themselves, one needs to act in every setting. And so I think that sort of really taught me etiquette, in sort of what that looks like, but also how do I break through that etiquette in ways that are in where that etiquette is unnecessary and it's sort of restrictive. And that was my start. So being an intern there, it's a great place to start because you don't have a lot of pressure to do much. Like I was like mostly a file clerk. I was doing a lot of filing for litigation. You sit in the back room, you file all day, and there was a couple other interns, so we had some like fun. We would always have some good laughs. But you would go out and you would speak to the attorneys, and you'd really see the way that they were presenting themselves and how they conducted themselves in that environment. And you can learn from it. You see like, okay, this is what it looks like. These people are heads down in their office for hours at a time, and they don't do anything other than work for hours at a time. And you really see that, and you're like, wow, I can really take away from this work ethic. And I didn't go to college, so in like a traditional university, and so I didn't have that understanding of what. And again, I also didn't really study heads down in high school much, to be honest. So like, I never really understood what it meant to really put your head down and work. And there was a couple other people in my life outside of the work environment that really contributed to that, understanding what it means to work hard. But that is something that I saw and I could take away from it. But then I was like, okay, I don't want to be an attorney, because every single attorney that I asked, that was another huge lesson that I got from this, was every single attorney that I asked, like, if they liked their job, or, what, like, their sort of what their recommendation is, they would always say turn the other way.
Oh, that's
Big
it. That's, and you got to listen up at those points in time. I'm like, wait, hold up. You telling me I'm an intern, No, turn the other way. Okay.
So I did.
And you ran with it. And that's how you got into like the data science, and like, that right there. Like, how do you feel like when you're doing like what you do currently, right? How could someone like yourself and the skills that you possess help out larger corporations?
Yeah, so I work for OMD now, and we are on the Apple account. So we work exclusively with Apple, and every single day we're in meetings with really high level folks at Apple, from the CMO of Apple all the way down. So and it's really incredible to see sort of how how analytics plays a big part. So I am not working much with data science in this role. I worked with some data science at a previous role, but in this one, it's mostly reporting, and that's sort of what I do. And it's our team is structured out in a way where it's separated into data tech, so the technical side, and then data operations, and so the operational side of data, which has a lot to do with the storage and how it actually gets to my desk. And then I'm on the reporting side. And so what we do is we take these numbers and we actually create a story out of them. And I think these and numbers, there's a big there's very big components to what makes a business successful. It's not all analytics. It is not all data. Data is gold in a respect, but there are other things, other commodities that are just as valuable, if not more. And you take a company like Apple. Steve Jobs wasn't sitting there crunching the numbers all day. When he started off building a PC, he was more so looking at what the market needed, and in a way, his brain
And the
was
service that he was going to provide. Yeah,
absolutely. And in a way, his brain was working in a deeply analytical way, but it wasn't necessarily in the way that I present analytics. But thinking about what I do specifically, it's huge. We have digital campaigns that are global, across multiple channels, from social to web to TV. And when people see these ads, it generates an impression, and it depends where the ad is living. But those impressions, it ultimately comes to our desk, and we take these performance numbers, we package them up, and we say to our client, hey, which is Apple, like, hey, this is how this campaign did. This is why it performed this way, and this is what we can do more of or less of to actually really make these campaigns as impactful as we can possibly make them. And we have some really beautiful and seriously impactful campaigns. So it's a lot of great work that's coming out right now.
It's good that when you look back at that data, sometimes it's a little bit overwhelming to look back at those things. I could only imagine, let alone putting all that stuff together. Like, so a question that when it comes out, I think about it. Whenever I had any colleagues or friends of mine that worked in data reporting and stuff, like, how do someone like yourself, have a intellectual conversation with your peers, your colleagues, and give them the insight, but not sound like condescending because you're talking about data?
I think if someone's easily in analytics, it's a really straightforward thing, right? I mean, you're looking at data, that's backed by numbers. Yes, numbers can be manipulated, but from a surface level, by the time it gets to my desk, it's in Excel, and what we do is, it's a lot of numbers, it's a lot of rows in Excel, but there's a lot of beautiful tools in our grasp today, in the modern world and in modern business, that really make things super efficient. But you really have to focus on sort of the positive within these stories, and how do we ultimately, if it is a negative, how do we actually focus on the positive coming out of that negative? And like, by that I mean, like, yes, something didn't perform well, it fell short of the benchmark, but how do we actually make sure on the next go we improve this? And whether that has to do with the placement of where the ad is actually going to be, like the buy, or the actual creative, like those things are all, and I would say that's really where like the condescending piece would come out of my role specifically, is sort of approaching creative criticism to a degree almost that comes out of analytics, and not really pissing off the creatives, because they are such a big component of it. And nobody likes to get their work criticized like in a negative way. At the end of the day, it's constructive, absolutely, but like it's difficult sometimes to go back to the creative and be like, hey, this is why this didn't perform, it's because of your art, almost.
They're like, what?
Exactly.
I took hours to make that happen. And you're like, no. I know, but I'm giving you the numbers don't lie. This is it. The sales.
Yeah, absolutely.
It is a very hard thing, especially when you're dealing with those kind of things. Like now, when you think of your career and altogether, like what's like one of the biggest challenges you face in your career so far, and like how did you like resolve it?
The biggest challenge that I faced in my career. So it's interesting, I think that we set up a lot of mental blocks in our career. We sort of tell ourselves like, hey, I'm not good enough to be speaking in this room, or I'm not good enough to say this, like in a respect, like I'm not in the position to say this. Like my role doesn't require me to do this. Like I think those are the biggest blocks that I face, as well as many of my peers. And then when you look around you and you look at the people that are in the positions that you sort of want to be in, they really didn't hesitate to get there. And sometimes they don't necessarily even deserve to be in those positions necessarily. Like what they're saying is not necessarily the best step or action to take. And obviously up for debate. But I think that like it has a lot to do with your own confidence, and like your own confidence in what you're saying and what you're doing. And I think we really like to create these constructs in our brains of like, and I'm guilty of this as well, of like, hey, this is like, I'm undeserving of this. And honestly, really, like that is the biggest block I think we all face in a lot of different avenues of this world. And I think if we take some time to really believe in ourselves, and it does sound a little bit cliche, but to really believe in ourselves and what we're doing, it really projects us a whole lot ahead. And by doing that, you really have to accept who you are and really look within and find your core. And through that, you find a lot of energy, and energy brings confidence, and confidence ultimately impacts your success.
Do you think that was like one of your biggest breakthroughs in your career? Like when did you realize that you were great at what you do?
So I was like presenting. I think public speaking has been something that actually was something that I felt comfortable doing for a long time. And it's always a work in progress. It's never perfect. You always are developing, and I get criticism to this day, after constructive criticism after presentation, and I think that's important. I think it has a lot to do with your leadership, like working under people in the jobs that we work in. It's really important that in a leadership role, you make the people below you feel comfortable enough to be themselves first, and then they will perform well for you. It's not they need to perform well and then they get sort of this like leniency or whatever. Like it's really important to recognize that as a leader, is like, hey, my team, it's really important that they first feel comfortable. And I think that does come back to cultural comfortability, someone that's attuned to who this person is and what their background is, being aware of those things, not saying things that can make them uncomfortable, being conscious of that, and not in an inauthentic way. And I think I've seen it be done in a really inauthentic way in my past, in my work experience, but in a really like just genuinely understanding who this person is, and then allowing them to have that creative mobility within their space to be able to perform well. And I think that's really what it comes down to.
Now you mentioned about the whole thing about finding your voice. That was like how we put these roadblocks. I have to kind of go back to that. How would you kind of like talk to like your colleague and give them advice? You know, um, with an immigrant back, and a colleague would say, for example, a colleague with an immigrant background, like how do you find your voice? Like how would you help them find their voice?
I think it's really being agile. I really think it's being comfortable enough to, it's taking a step back, understanding, at the end of the day, also the pressure that lives within all of us, it comes from a place of just like like life is forever or something. And I think it has a lot to do with recognizing like, hey, this is, I don't know what the next place is, after this beautiful life. But and not to get all existential on you, but I think it's really taking a moment and recognizing, there's not a promise. And I think it's really important to just say, hey, like I need to make these steps. And I really do. If you want to, it also depends on what your goal is as well. If your goal is to impact, the world, or if your goal is to impact your neighborhood, it just really involves looking within. Like, take a second, take a step back, find yourself on a spiritual level. And whatever that looks like for a lot of different people, I think that's really the most important piece, like spending time in nature or spending time writing, like spending time just kind of practicing these little exercises that give yourself transparency into what you genuinely are feeling so that you can find energy through that. I think that's a big part of it. And it really is like, you're not going to necessarily find yourself if you are constantly sort of trying to accommodate other people,
That is
assimilate,
true.
like
Yeah.
trying to form fit all the time, like it works really well for some people, because there's certain places where you can excel at, and there's particular people that can excel in that way. But a lot of us live in this world, and we sometimes can find ourselves not really finding our place, and that's because it takes some time, and you have to really look inward and really think to myself, how can I be the most flexible? How can I be the most, just bring that word in, just agile, just agility? Like, how
Yeah,
do
you
I
got to be
find that?
grounded. You got to, because in the corporate America, or even in the industry, depending on where people are working, like you could kind of easily get distracted and be like, you know what? There's no time for me to find a voice. I'll just stay quiet. I won't talk. I'll just keep my head down and keep moving forward.
Mhm.
And then you lose track of yourself. You lose track of who you are and what you stand for sometimes, or you start mimicking, other individuals in your office because you're like, well, they're getting along, they're getting moving ahead faster in this industry, so I might as well follow behind their footsteps versus following the footsteps that you came in with. So
Mhm.
it is a very hard thing, and a lot of the guests on our show have kind of truly dived into that, and that's a big conversation, like finding your voice, especially as an immigrant, coming in here and saying, or having an immigrant family and working towards where you are, so it's a lot. I want to ask you a question on, like, what is like the most fun part of your job right now? When you were talking about your career and your role, your current role, like what do you do that makes it that fun?
I think the most fun part, and yeah, I think I would say, well, I wanted to address the last thing you said as well, but I think just real quick, the most fun part of my job specifically is for me interacting with people, like on a surface level, presenting. That's something that I particularly enjoy to do. So when I get the opportunity to present, the findings that the team came up with, it's a really fun process for me. Um, it's also almost like a game day, like feeling like it's like if there's pressure, like there's a lot of people on the call, there's a lot of eyes on the work that we put together as a team and myself, and I'd say that it's a little, sometimes it can be a little nerve wracking, but like I get a deep level of satisfaction out of being able to actually bring that to the table and say like, hey, this is what we did, and it's really a wonderful experience for me, like, because it's really acceptance of, like, despite whatever the outcome is, it's just like, this is what we did, as a team. This is what, like, the congregation of so many people's effort looks like at the end result. It's a package that presents that information, that those findings, and I think that's a really fun experience for me. Like, that's really what I get the most satisfaction of, I would say, within this job.
Well, it's good that you have that aspect of fun. Sometimes people lose track of that. They're like, oh, I just got to work. No, 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 no. It should be fun. You should want to go to work. You should want to, you should want to feel like you're inspired or happy or excited, or that you're actually making a difference in people's lives, right? Now, when backtracking to like that childhood, mom and dad giving you those gems and helping you out, understand, giving a little piece of you. Do you think your childhood and your cultural background has helped you see things differently in the corporate world?
Absolutely. Oh yeah. Everybody's childhood experience impacts, their perception of the world. And like, it doesn't even matter where you come from. It's every single person, and that's what makes us so, like, brilliantly unique within each other, within the independent person. It's like that perspective that you bring to the table. And like, I think that a big part of how we do actually find our happiness and our ability to find our voice is through our childhood. It's through actually accepting deeply, and genuinely, wholeheartedly who we are at our deepest core. And then through that, and that's like intensely actually leaning on those like things that we find are flaws, like I think that like growing up, there's a lot of it, like my parents would argue a lot, they're two very passionate people. And so I grew up in an environment where there's sometimes it wasn't necessarily the most comfortable environment, and I had to mediate, like in between both of my parents. And I think that probably contributed pretty drastically to like who I am today and my ability to actually sit in a room where it's a high tense environment sometimes, and being level headed enough to think, like how do we actually go through this problem without getting too, I don't want to say too emotionally engaged, because I really do actually support emotional engagement. Like I think that our professional lives, we're human beings, and inevitably the professional is emotional. It lives within all of us, and to say that we cannot be emotional in the workplace is not, in my opinion, correct. I think it has a lot to do with just how do we handle those emotions and how do we make it the most efficient and constructive for us. And so, yeah, that my childhood deeply impacted that. And I think it was for those reasons. Like it really has a lot to do with understanding who you are as a kid. But yeah, that's something that I did a lot of. I mediated a lot when I was a kid. And I also spent a lot of time, again, my parents were able to take me into the outdoors a lot. That's another aspect that I think also really impacted myself.
That's a very good thing, a beautiful thing when you could kind of like tap back into your childhood. Sometimes people have upbringings where they're like, I don't even want to remember it, but you're like, I could tap back in, and that tapping back in is helping me excel in my career. It's making me excel with my colleagues. It's making me excel in the way I present myself, the way I, speak to my colleagues, the way I carry myself. That's a very, very important thing. And you highlighted it a lot when you said a lot of us, our childhood, that could really shape, how you are in the industry or in corporate America. Do you have that backbone? Were you speaking up for yourself back then? Will give you an opportunity potentially to speak up for yourself right now in your current standings. Now, in your opinion, what is like the balance between making a decision strictly based on like data science and looking at other factors?
So I think making a decision analytically is an important one when it comes to when we're trying to hit a benchmark. And like benchmarks are a big part of what we see sort of a lot of corporate environments relying on to determine success. That's when we come in and we say this is what analytics can tell us. Like it has a lot to do with the goal of what the campaign is or what the mission is of whatever the project is. If it's to gain awareness of something, there's a way we can determine what awareness is actually quantified as. If we're going to get a result digitally, like we're going to get something tracked, like it's a like let's just boil it down to what everybody has access to is just a like on a post. Like if that is dictating what success looks like for us, then we can, we can take a group of posts and we can say whatever got the most liked, why did it get the most liked? And that's when we can, then we take a step out of the analytic aspect of it and we say, okay, what does this creative look like now? Does it feature a dog? And this is really like bare bones. We're really thinking just really small, like your account right now. Like let's say the photo of a dog did really well. Okay, now creatively speaking, how do we take that a step further? Like, let's take the dog, let's put him in the woods. Like, let's put a little cute vest on the dog. Let's put him next to a campfire. This is a beautiful photo. This photo is something that is creatively driven, but now we're able to sort of come to that conclusion through analytics, and that's a tool that's given to us in this digital age.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Iman, you definitely hitting some stuff today, man. You definitely hitting some gems. I appreciate you saying all these things. Like, there's a lot of things that I'm even taking away from this conversation. Now, um, a question I want to kind of drop right now and kind of get your understanding on is like, when was like your proudest, moment in your career? Like where you could look back right now and be like, I know you had a lot of great experiences, from the internship to your current job and working in corporate America, your first job, but like, what's like one of the proudest moments that you've had
I
looking
think,
back?
yeah, that's a good question. That's a good question. I think like one of the proudest moments for me, personally, has been just gaining my independence and not having my resources come from family, because family puts a lot like into my family specifically, my parents emotionally, they invest so much into making sure that you are in a place where that you can feel like you can step out and essentially give to the world. And like my mom, she really took some time, and my dad as well, and like she took some time to like make me feel appreciated in those moments of like, hey, this is your birthday, we're going to celebrate it, like those smaller things. And again, this is a privilege, like this is a beautiful like privilege that I was lucky enough to have. And some people don't necessarily have that. And so it's almost on you and your responsibility to find sort of what drives you. But for me, the proudest moment for me was being able to take a step out and not rely on my parents to provide every single thing for me, because I see how hard that they work. And for me to be able to make sure that my parents don't have to worry about me necessarily is that's the biggest thing that I can give back to my parents, in my opinion.
Excellent way of
Yeah.
thinking of that. That is big. That's big. That's big. Go
Yeah,
on, what you're saying.
I would love to buy my parents a beautiful home and stuff, and a car, and those tangible like things that we all I guess people thrive to have. But like
Yes. Yes.
I think ultimately the biggest thing that you could do is just at the very least is make sure you're in a position where they don't have to allocate resources that are sort of like financial or whatever. The emotional, sometimes they will, but like financial for me is the biggest one. And I think that's like it's really important that they don't have to necessarily worry about that aspect. And that was a big
Mhm.
that was a big proud moment for me.
That is that, especially like when you go leaving out of like, for example, like an institution like a college or university, and you're like, all right, I'm gonna enter into corporate America. Parents are like, wait, I'm letting my child leave and go into the real world now. But they're always afraid of like, are they going to be successful? Are they going to have enough, income coming in? Are they going to have a voice for themselves? Because no one knows. No one really knows unless and obviously experiences help you get there. So it is, it is like you said, getting them a house, getting them a nice yacht, a boat. You know, is something that they would probably be, oh, I'm not going to turn that down. But at the same time, knowing that you're at a place where you're stable and they don't have to actually contribute on a regular basis to your success is definitely a blessing for them.
Absolutely.
Now, my last question to you is really just when you think about your whole life, you think about your career, you think about where you come from, you think about your upbringing and your culture and your parents and all the gems that they have given to you. Do you have any advice for young children, who want to follow in your footsteps after listening to this interview?
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's be stubborn, do your thing. Like, don't feel pressured to fit any role that society puts in front of you. Like, if you were to ask me what my biggest accomplishment was, it was like 3 years ago, I would say it's that I didn't go to college and I still got like a corporate job. But like to me, I think that's something that we all said it's sold to us as a kid, as sort of children. It's like, hey, you need to go to college to be successful. You need to do this to be successful. You need to do that to look good or look cool or this or that. Like, none of that really matters. It's really, really important to focus within on what makes you happy and then remain extremely stubborn in that avenue. Like, don't accept don't accept anything that's less than what you simply deserve. Like, and that's the bottom line. Like, that does not mean that you will fall. As a matter of fact, you will probably fall harder than anybody else that you know and hurt more than anybody else that you know, but that is because you are pursuing something that's much greater than yourself. And like, those pursuits inevitably result in greater pain, but if you're able to actually capitalize on that, like, you will ultimately find that you are much happier as a human being and you're able to contribute to this world in a much greater way if you're not simply just following the path of what everyone else is doing. And like, I think that's the most important thing that any child could do to make themselves feel happy in this world.
Well said. I one thing I always like to highlight when I'm talking to individuals, I always say when people say, Paul, what do you think is like a very important thing to give. Like you could say right now, last couple of words. I always say, don't play with your happiness. Bottom line, like
Absolutely.
that stuff is priceless. Being able to, we take for granted the ability to smile. We take for granted sometimes the ability just to just wake up and just feel that sense of excitement. And, you know, it's like you just run through it every single day. But it is a blessing to find things or find a partner or a job or career that could really excite you every single day. And some people they struggle with not trying to find their happiness. They don't really tap into it. They're like, oh, you know what? I think I'm happy, but I could settle. But you know, striving, like you said, being stubborn about that and being like, you know what? There's more happiness for me out there, and I want it. You know, so kudos for you for finding it, and kudos to you for all the things you've been doing. Congratulations on everything, and I appreciate you sharing a lot of insight with us on the show today about your culture, your family, your upbringing, your jobs, corporate America. Shout out to you working those those other jobs, the Hollisters and the GNCs. You know, I think you're one of the first people, first individuals, the guests on the show to kind of highlight those companies. You know, some people are like, oh yeah, I had an internship. You know, I worked at a convenience store, but you were like, no, and people know what that experience feels like, but they see it, they're like, wow. So you moved around a lot, and look where you are now. So your upbringing and your family definitely are very proud of you. I could only imagine. So thank you again for joining us on the show today, Iman.
Yeah, Paul, they were great questions. Those
Yeah, no worries. I appreciate that. And I want the listeners to know if you want to hear more inspirational stories like Iman, please check us out on ZakaConnect.com. Follow our social at Zaka Connect and follow our feed, Zaka, wherever you listen to your podcast.